The wind swept across the barren plains of Wyoming Territory, carrying with it the taste of dust and the promise of another scorching day. Silas McBride stood on the porch of his modest ranch house, watching the sun bleed crimson across the horizon. It was 1887, and the land was as unforgiving as the memories that haunted him. At 32, Silas looked older than his years. The harsh prairie sun had etched deep lines around his gray eyes, and his calloused hands spoke of endless days wrestling with stubborn soil and ornery cattle. He owned 40 acres of land that fought him for every blade of grass, every drop of water. Most men would have given up by now, sold out to the bigger ranches pushing in from the east. But Silas had nowhere else to go, and someone counting on him to stay. "Uncle Silas?" The small voice drew him from his thoughts. 8-year-old Eli stood in the doorway, his thin frame drowning in hand-me-down clothes that had once belonged to another boy in town. The child's dark hair fell into eyes that held too much caution for someone so young. "Supper ready?" Silas asked, though he could smell the beans and salt pork from where he stood. "Yes, sir." Eli's response was barely above a whisper. The boy had lived with him for nearly 8 years now, since he was just weeks old, but still moved through the house like a ghost, afraid of disturbing the living. They ate in silence, as was their custom. Silas had never been much for conversation, and Eli had learned early that words were often unnecessary between them. The boy ate methodically, careful not to spill, careful not to make noise with his spoon against the tin plate. Everything about him was careful, measured, as if he understood instinctively that his place in this world was precarious. After supper, Eli cleared the table without being asked while Silas stepped outside to check on the horses. 3 years ago, he'd had 6. Now only 2 remained, sold off one by one to keep them fed through the brutal winters. As he ran his hand along the bay mare's flank, his thoughts drifted to Thomas, as they often did in the quiet moments. His older brother had been everything Silas wasn't: charming, quick to laugh, full of dreams bigger than the territory itself. Thomas had worked the coal mines 60 miles north, sending money home when he could, promising that someday they'd pool their savings and buy proper cattle land. Then came the explosion that took him and 12 other men, leaving behind nothing but memorial markers and broken promises. And Eli, the boy, had arrived 3 weeks after Thomas's death, brought by a traveling preacher who'd found him with a wet nurse in Cheyenne. There'd been a note, written in a woman's careful hand. "His name is Eli. Please see that he's cared for. T.M. would have wanted this. T.M. Thomas McBride." Silas had taken the infant without question, though the townspeople had plenty of their own. Whispers followed him whenever he went to town for supplies, about the woman Thomas was supposed to marry. Clara, her name had been, who disappeared the night before their wedding. About how convenient it was that a baby appeared so soon after. About bloodlines and legitimacy and shame. He bore it all in silence, the way he bore everything else. What else could he do? The boy needed a home, and Silas had already lost too much to lose anything more. The sound of hoofbeats on the hard-packed road drew him from the barn. A rider approached through the gathering dusk, moving fast, too fast for casual travel. Silas's hand moved instinctively to the rifle propped against the fence post. "Silas McBride?" The rider was young, maybe 17, with the look of someone paid to deliver messages. "Got a letter for you? Come in on the afternoon stage." Silas took the envelope, noting the careful script on the front. Not local postmark, somewhere back east. His stomach tightened as he broke the seal. "Dear Mr. McBride," he read by the fading light. "You may not remember me, as we met only briefly during your brother's funeral. I am Miss Margaret Dawson, formerly of Boston, and I write to you with a proposition that may seem unusual, but which I hope you will consider with an open mind." His hand stilled. Margaret Dawson. The name stirred something in his memory. A woman in black at Thomas's funeral, standing apart from the other mourners. She'd left before he could speak to her, and he'd thought nothing more of it. Until now. "I understand that you are unmarried and maintaining a household with a young boy who requires a mother's care." I find myself in circumstances that necessitate a change of situation, and I am prepared to travel west as what is commonly termed a mail-order bride. I knew your brother well, and I believe I could be of service to his son." The letter trembled in his hands. His son. She called Eli Thomas's son, just as everyone did. But there was something in the phrasing, something that made his chest tight with unnamed dread. "If this arrangement is agreeable to you, I can arrive on the westbound train in 3 weeks' time. I ask only for shelter, sustenance, and the opportunity to help raise the boy in a proper home. I have included a photograph for your consideration." Silas pulled out the small photograph. Even in the sepia tones, he could see she was beautiful, dark hair swept up, intelligent eyes that seemed to look right through the camera. But it was the sadness in her face that struck him most, a grief that matched his own. He looked back at the house where Eli was likely already preparing for bed, moving through his evening routines with that same careful precision. The boy needed more than Silas could give him. He needed gentle words and patient teaching, needed someone who knew how to soothe nightmares and mend more than just torn clothes. But marriage? To a woman he didn't know, who claimed connection to Thomas but had vanished like morning mist after the funeral. The wind picked up, rattling the loose board on the barn that he kept meaning to fix. Everything here needed fixing. The fence, the roof, the well pump that required coaxing every morning, and somewhere deep inside, parts of himself that had broken the day they pulled Thomas from that mine. He folded the letter carefully, tucking it into his shirt pocket along with the photograph. 3 weeks. Not much time to prepare for a woman in a house that had known only men's rough ways. Not much time to decide if he was ready to let someone else into the careful, quiet world he and Eli had built from the ashes of loss. That night, after Eli had gone to bed, Silas sat by the dying fire and pulled out the letter again. In the flickering light, he studied Margaret Dawson's face, trying to read the truth in those distant eyes. What had she been to Thomas? Why had she waited until now to reach out? And what secrets lay behind her carefully worded proposal? The wind howled outside, throwing sand against the windows like tiny fists knocking for entry. Somewhere in the darkness, a coyote called to its pack, the sound lonely and wild. Silas knew that sound, knew that loneliness. Maybe that's why, when he finally took up his pen to write a response, his hand moved almost of its own accord. "Miss Dawson," he wrote, his penmanship rough compared to hers. "Your letter was unexpected but not unwelcome. The boy could indeed benefit from a woman's presence. If you are certain of your decision, you will find shelter here. The territory is not kind to the genteel, but we will do what we can to make you comfortable." He paused, pen hovering over the paper. There was more he wanted to ask, more he needed to know. But the words wouldn't come. They never did. So he simply signed his name and sealed the envelope, consigning their futures to the uncertainties of the postal service and the mysteries of the human heart. As he prepared for bed, Silas stopped at Eli's door. The boy slept curled on his side, one arm wrapped around the stuffed horse Silas had bought him last Christmas, the only toy he owned. In sleep, the caution melted from his face, leaving only the vulnerability of childhood. "Change is coming, boy," Silas whispered to the darkness. "God help us both." Outside, the wind continued its relentless assault on the house, and the stars looked down with cold indifference on the small ranch where 3 lives were about to converge in ways none of them could foresee. The morning air bit sharp against Silas's face as he stood on the wooden platform, watching the black smoke of the approaching train rise against the pale October sky. 3 weeks had passed in a blur of preparation, scrubbing floors that hadn't seen a proper cleaning in years, patching the worst of the roof leaks, converting the storage room into something resembling a woman's quarters. Eli had helped without question, his small hands working alongside Silas's larger ones, though the boy's eyes held questions he didn't voice. The train's whistle pierced the air, and Silas found himself straightening his coat, running a hand through hair he'd trimmed just that morning. Around him, other men waited for their own mail-order brides, some holding flowers, others clutching photographs worn soft from handling. Silas held nothing but doubt, The train wheezed to a stop, steam billowing across the platform. Passengers began to disembark. Traveling salesmen, a few ranchers returning from business back east, a mother herding 3 small children. Then he saw her. Margaret Dawson stepped down from the train car with the careful grace of someone accustomed to different circumstances. Her traveling dress, though plain, spoke of quality in its cut and cloth. Dark hair was swept up beneath a simple hat, and when she turned to scan the platform, Silas caught his breath. The photograph hadn't done justice to the depth of sadness in her eyes, or the determined set of her jaw. Their eyes met across the crowded platform. Recognition flickered in hers, not of him, but of something else, something that made her pause mid-step. Then she was moving toward him, her single trunk handled by a porter who looked relieved to set it down. "Mr. McBride." Her voice was lower than he'd expected, roughened perhaps by the long journey. Up close, he could see the fine lines around her eyes, the weariness that powder couldn't quite hide. "Miss Dawson." He found himself at a loss for more words. What did one say to a stranger who'd traveled 1,000 miles to share your life? "The wagon's just outside." She nodded, following him in silence. It wasn't until they were clear of town, the horses finding their rhythm on the rutted road, that she spoke again. "How's the boy?" "Eli's well enough. Quiet." Silas kept his eyes on the road ahead. "He knows you're coming. And what does he think of it?" "Hard to say. Boy keeps his thoughts to himself, mostly." A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "Like his uncle." Then, the observation hung between them, too accurate for comfort. Silas found himself studying her from the corner of his eye. There was something about the way she held herself, back straight despite the wagon's jolting, that spoke of steel beneath the feminine exterior. They were halfway home when she asked, "Do you have a daguerreotype of Thomas?" The question hit like a physical blow. "No, never had the money for such things." "I see." She reached into her reticule, withdrawing a small leather case. "I have one, from before." She opened it, revealing a young man's smiling face. Thomas, captured in a moment of happiness Silas had almost forgotten existed. His hands tightened on the reins. "Why show me this?" "Because Eli should know his father's face." She closed the case carefully. "Whatever else happens, he deserves that." The word father sat heavy between them, loaded with implications neither seemed ready to address. The ranch appeared around the final bend, looking smaller and shabbier than Silas remembered. He watched Margaret take it in. The sagging fence, the weathered boards, the endless stretch of brown grass fighting the approaching winter. "It's not much," he began, but she cut him off. "It's shelter. That's all I asked for." Eli stood on the porch, his thin body tense as a bowstring. As the wagon rolled to a stop, Silas saw the boy's eyes fix on Margaret with an intensity that seemed beyond his years. Margaret climbed down without waiting for assistance, her movements careful but determined. "Hello, Eli?" She didn't move closer, didn't try to embrace him or offer false cheer. She simply stood there, letting him look his fill. The boy's mouth opened, closed, opened again. "Ma'am?" The word came out cracked, uncertain. "Are you hungry? It's past dinner time." Eli nodded slowly, and something in his posture eased fractionally. "I can show you the kitchen. I'd like that." Silas watched them disappear into the house, feeling like an intruder in his own home. He busied himself with the horses and Margaret's trunk, taking longer than necessary, delaying the moment when he'd have to go inside and face whatever came next. When he finally entered, the smell hit him first, something savory and rich, completely unlike the simple fare he and Eli had survived on. Margaret stood at the stove, sleeves rolled up, working with the confidence of someone who knew her way around a kitchen. Eli sat at the table, watching her with that same intense focus. "I hope you don't mind," she said without turning. "I found some dried beans and a bit of pork. There were herbs growing wild by the fence, sage and thyme." "Thomas loved thyme," Eli said suddenly, then looked stricken, as if the words had escaped without permission. Margaret's hand stilled for just a moment. "Did he?" He always said it reminded him of our mother's cooking. Our? Silas couldn't help the question. She turned then, meeting his eyes directly. Thomas and I were cousins. Mr. McBride, second cousins, but we grew up near each other in Boston. I thought you knew. He shook his head, processing this new information. It explained some things. Her presence at the funeral, the familiarity in her letter. But it raised other questions too. Questions that would have to wait. They ate in relative quiet, though it was a different kind of silence than Silas and Eli usually shared. This one felt expectant, like the air before a storm. Margaret asked simple questions about the ranch, the town, their daily routines. Eli answered more readily than Silas had heard him speak in months. After supper, Margaret insisted on cleaning up alone. "You must have evening chores," she said, and it wasn't a question. Silas found himself outside, Eli trailing after him, both of them a bit lost in their familiar routine now that someone else occupied their space. "She knew him," Eli said quietly as they fed the horses. "My PA. She knew him before." "Seems so. Do you think—" The boy trailed off, but Silas could guess the question. "Do you think she knew my mother too?" It was the question Eli never asked, but always carried. The wondering about the woman who'd brought him into the world and then vanished like smoke. "I don't know. Boy, maybe in time she'll tell us." When they returned to the house, they found Margaret had transformed the main room. The floors were swept, the windows cleaned of their coat of dust, and a fire crackled cheerfully in the hearth that usually sat cold. She'd found Thomas's old quilt in the trunk at the foot of Silas's bed and spread it over the worn sofa. "I hope you don't mind," she said again, and Silas realized it was a phrase he'd be hearing often. It seemed a shame not to use it. The quilt had been their mother's, one of the few things the brothers had brought west. Silas hadn't been able to look at it since Thomas died, but now, spread out in the firelight, it seemed to bring warmth to the room that had nothing to do with temperature. "I've made up the storage room," he said gruffly. "It's not much, but it's private. I'm sure it will do perfectly." She rose, smoothing her skirts. "If you'll excuse me, it's been a long journey." After she'd retired, Silas sat by the fire while Eli prepared for bed. The boy moved differently tonight, less ghost-like, more present. When he paused at Margaret's door, ear pressed against the wood, Silas didn't scold him. "She's crying," Eli whispered, pulling back as if burned. Silas had no answer for that. What comfort could he offer to a woman's tears when he didn't even understand their cause? So he simply guided Eli to his own room, tucking him in with hands that felt clumsy and inadequate. "Uncle Silas?" The boy's voice was small in the darkness. "Are you going to marry her?" "That's the arrangement." "Will she stay?" The question cut deep, touching on fears Silas hadn't even named. How many people had left this boy already? How many more would he lose before he learned to stop asking? "I don't know," Silas answered honestly. "But she's here now." It seemed to be enough. Eli turned onto his side, clutching his stuffed horse, and Silas left him to his dreams. Back in the main room, the fire had died to embers. Through the thin walls, he could hear Margaret moving about her room, the rustle of fabric, the creak of the old bed frame. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new questions, new silences to navigate. But tonight, for the first time in 3 years, the house felt less empty. He looked at Thomas's quilt, spread across the sofa like a bridge between past and future. Whatever secrets Margaret carried, whatever truths waited to be revealed, they would face them as they faced everything else in this hard country, one day at a time, with grit and grace and the kind of stubborn hope that kept people moving west when everything else had failed. The wind picked up outside, but the house stood firm against it. 3 souls under one roof, each nursing private griefs, each wondering if healing was possible in a land that seemed designed to break whatever it touched. Time would tell, as time always did. But for tonight, it was enough that they were no longer alone. 2 weeks had passed since Margaret's arrival, and the ranch had settled into new rhythms. She rose before dawn to start breakfast, worked alongside them during the day, and retired early to her small room. But tonight was different. The November wind howled like a wounded animal, and the temperature had dropped so fierce that ice formed on the inside of the windows. Silas had spent the day reinforcing the barn, knowing what was coming. By evening, the storm hit full force, not snow, but a brutal ice storm that turned the world into a glittering, deadly wonderland. The house groaned under the assault, and somewhere in the walls, wood cracked like gunfire. "The horses," Eli said, his face pressed against the window. "They're scared." "They're sheltered," Silas assured him, though he too worried about the animals. "Nothing we can do now but wait it out." Margaret emerged from her room wrapped in a shawl, her face pale in the lamplight. "The storage room, my room, the roof is leaking badly. Ice is coming through." Silas cursed under his breath. He'd patched that roof, but ice storms had a way of finding every weakness. "Gather your things. You can't stay there tonight." She nodded, disappearing back into the room. Eli looked between them with wide eyes. Where will she sleep? It was a fair question with no good answer. The house had only 2 other rooms, Silas's bedroom and Eli's tiny space. The main room offered no privacy, and the temperatures would be brutal anywhere away from the fire. Margaret returned with an armful of belonging on her few dresses already showing damp spots from the leaking roof. "I can make do in here," she said, gesturing to the main room. "By the fire. The floor's too cold. You'll catch your death." The words came out harsher than Silas intended. He ran a hand through his hair, considering options that all seemed improper. "Take my room. I'll sleep out here." "I couldn't. It's the warmest room in the house. Please." Something passed between them in that moment, an acknowledgement of the intimacy of the offer. She nodded once, gathering her things. As she passed him, he caught the scent of lavender soap, incongruous in this rough place. The storm worsened as night fell. Silas tried to sleep on the sofa. Thomas's quilt pulled tight around him, but the cold seeped through. Every blast of wind made him think of the horses, the chickens, the fragile life they'd built here that could be swept away by nature's fury. A sound made him sit up. Footsteps in the hallway. Margaret appeared, still in her day dress, carrying his extra blanket. "You're freezing," she said simply. "I could hear your teeth chattering from the bedroom." "I'm fine. You're not." She spread the blanket over him with efficient movements. "Eli needs you healthy. Pride won't keep pneumonia away." She turned to go, but another crack of breaking wood made her freeze. The house shuddered, and somewhere glass shattered. "The kitchen window," Silas said, already moving. They rushed to find ice and wind pouring through the broken pane, working together. They pushed the heavy table against the opening, then nailed boards over it. Margaret held the wood while Silas hammered, their bodies close in the small space. When it was done, they stood breathing hard, covered in ice crystals. Margaret's hair had come loose from its pins, falling around her shoulders in dark waves. In the dim light, with color high in her cheeks from exertion, she looked younger, more like the girl Thomas might have known. "You should go back to bed," Silas said, his voice rough. "So should you." But neither moved. The storm had created a strange intimacy, as if the normal rules were suspended while nature raged outside. "Tell me about Thomas," she said suddenly. "Tell me about him here, in this life. I knew him as a boy in Boston. But the man, I never got to know the man he became." They found themselves back by the dying fire, sitting closer than propriety allowed, sharing the blankets out of necessity. Silas fed the flames with precious wood and began to talk. He told her about Thomas's laugh that could fill a room, about his terrible singing that he inflicted on anyone nearby, about how he'd saved for months to buy Eli's stuffed horse, even though the boy was too young to remember, about the dreams of cattle and prosperity that kept him going into that mine day after day. "He wrote to me," Margaret said when Silas fell silent. "Every month for a year. Then the letters stopped." "When did they stop?" 6 months before he died, right around the time." She trailed off, wrapping her arms around herself. the time Eli would have been conceived. The words hung between them like icicles, sharp and dangerous. "I came out for the wedding," Margaret continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thomas met me at the station, so proud, so excited. He'd rented rooms at the boarding house, had the preacher scheduled, everything arranged. But she, Clara, she was already gone, left in the night without a word." "You knew her?" "We'd corresponded. She seemed troubled in her letters, but I thought it was just nerves. Thomas was devastated. He went looking for her, spent weeks searching. Then he got word about the baby." Silas stared into the fire, pieces of the puzzle shifting in his mind. But if Clara left before the wedding? That's what I tried to tell him. The timing was wrong. But Thomas wouldn't hear it. He said the child needed a father, needed a name. He was going to claim Eli as his own regardless. "And you left." Margaret's laugh was bitter. "What else could I do? Watch the man I'd loved since childhood raise another woman's child? I was young and foolish and proud. I thought—" She shook her head. "It doesn't matter what I thought." The confession hung in the air. She'd loved Thomas. Of course she had. It explained everything and nothing all at once. "Why come back now?" Silas asked. "Why marry me?" She turned to look at him directly, and in the firelight, her eyes were almost black. "Because I've spent 3 years regretting my cowardice. Because Thomas is gone and that child still needs a mother. Because—" She paused, seeming to gather courage. "Because in all his letters, Thomas wrote about you, his steady brother, his anchor. He said if anything ever happened to him, I should find you, that you'd do right by anyone who needed help." The wind chose that moment to slam into the house with renewed fury. The walls creaked ominously, and from somewhere came the sound of splitting wood. Without thinking, Silas pulled Margaret against him as debris hit the roof above. For a moment, they stayed frozen like that, her face pressed against his shoulder, his arms protective around her. She was smaller than he'd realized, fragile seeming despite her strength. When the danger passed, they pulled apart slowly, awareness crackling between them like the ice on the windows. "I should—" she began. Yes, he agreed, but neither moved. The storm had stripped away pretense, leaving only 2 people seeking warmth in a cold world. When Margaret shivered, Silas didn't think, just pulled the blanket around both of them. She leaned into him, and they sat like that, watching the fire die to embers. "What was she like?" Margaret asked eventually. "Clara?" Silas searched his memory. "Pretty, quiet, seemed scared most of the time, like a rabbit ready to bolt. Thomas thought he could save her from whatever she was running from. Maybe she couldn't be saved. Maybe none of us can." Margaret pulled back to look at him. "You don't believe that." "Don't I?" "No. If you did, you wouldn't have taken Eli. Wouldn't have agreed to this arrangement. You're still trying to save people, just like your brother." The observation cut too close to truth Silas didn't examine. He stood abruptly, stepping away from the dangerous warmth of her presence. "Storm's passing. You should get some sleep." She rose as well, wrapping the shawl tight around her shoulders. At the bedroom door, she paused. "Silas, thank you for telling me about him. For—" she gestured helplessly at the space between them. "For all of it." After she left, Silas stood in the cold room, listening to the storm's death throes. Everything had changed tonight. The careful boundaries they'd maintained were crumbling like ice in spring. He thought of Thomas, of the choices made and unmade, of the child sleeping down the hall, who deserved better than the half-truths they'd all been living. When he finally lay back down on the sofa, he could still smell lavender, still feel the ghost of her warmth against his side. Outside, the wind was dying, but inside, something else was just beginning to stir, something that felt dangerously like hope. The early December sun cast long shadows across the frost-covered ground as Margaret made her way toward town. She'd told Silas she needed supplies, but her true destination was the small Presbyterian church at the edge of Willow Creek. Reverend Porter had sent word that he needed to speak with her. Urgently, the message said She found him in the vestry, older than she remembered from Thomas's funeral, his once dark hair now thoroughly silver. His face was kind but troubled as he gestured for her to sit. "Miss Dawson, forgive me, Mrs. McBride, thank you for coming. Your message seemed pressing. Reverend." He pulled open a drawer, withdrawing an envelope yellowed with age. "I've wrestled with this for 3 years, kept it locked away, thinking it best buried with the dead, but with you here now, with the boy growing up." He pushed the envelope across the desk. "Thomas gave this to me the week before he died. Said if anything happened to him, I was to keep it safe until the right time." Margaret's hands trembled as she recognized Thomas's handwriting. Inside was a single sheet, dated just days before the mine explosion. "My dear cousin," she read silently, "if you're reading this, then my premonitions prove true. The mine grows more dangerous each day, and I fear my luck is running thin. There are things you must know, truths I couldn't bring myself to speak while living. Eli is not my son. You suspected as much. I think Clara came to me already with child, seeking help. She'd been hurt by a man who held power over her, a man whose name she wouldn't speak but whose cruelty was written in her eyes. She fled to the territory to escape him, but shame followed her like a shadow. I offered marriage to give the child a name, to give her protection, but she couldn't bear it. The kindness seemed to hurt her worse than cruelty. The night before our wedding, she vanished. I searched everywhere, but she'd covered her tracks well. 3 weeks later, the preacher brought Eli to my door. Clara had left him with the sisters at the convent in Cheyenne, along with a note begging me to raise him. How could I refuse? He was innocent of all of it. I've left this truth with Reverend Porter because I'm a coward. I can't bear to see the disappointment in Silas's eyes when he learns I've lied to him all these months. But if I'm gone, and if you found your way to my brother as I always hoped you would, then perhaps the truth can finally set us all free. Take care of them. Margaret, Silas is the best man I know, but he builds walls around his heart higher than any frontier fortress. And Eli, that boy deserves to be loved for who he is, not for the ghost of who he isn't." "Oh, my love, Thomas." Margaret sat in stunned silence, the letter clutched in her hands. Reverend Porter watched her with sympathetic eyes. "He was a good man, your Thomas. Not many would have done what he did." "No," Margaret agreed softly. "Not many would have." She folded the letter carefully, her mind racing. "Reverend, who else knows?" About the letter, no one, but there were whispers when Clara first arrived. She stayed with the widow Harrison for a time, and women talk. Most folks assume Thomas was the father despite the timeline. Easier to believe than the alternative. The alternative being? The Reverend shifted uncomfortably. There were rumors about Judge Blackwood back in Denver. How his housemaids never lasted long. How some left town in a hurry. Clara had worked in his household before coming here. Margaret's blood ran cold. Judge Blackwood was powerful, connected. The kind of man whose reach extended far beyond Denver. If he was Eli's father? "Thank you, Reverend." She stood, tucking the letter into her coat. "I trust you'll continue to keep this confidential?" "Of course, but Mrs. McBride, the boy has a right to know eventually." "Yes," she agreed. "But not yet. Not until he's strong enough to bear it." The ride back to the ranch felt endless. How could she face Silas with this knowledge? How could she look at Eli and not see the violence that had created him? By the time she reached home, the sun was setting, painting the sky the color of old blood. She found Silas in the barn, mending harnesses. He looked up at her entrance, and something in her face must have betrayed her because he immediately set down his work. "What's happened? I need to speak with you, privately." They walked out to the far pasture. Beyond earshot of the house, the wind was bitter, but Margaret barely felt it. She pulled out the letter, handing it to him without preamble. "The Reverend gave me this. From Thomas." She watched Silas read, saw the moment comprehension dawned. His face went through a series of changes: surprise, anger, grief, and finally something that looked like resignation. "You knew," he said flatly. "Before you came here, you knew Eli wasn't his." "I suspected. The timing never made sense. But I didn't know about how he came to be." Silas crumpled the letter in his fist. "All this time, I've been raising the child of the man who—" He couldn't finish, fury choking the words. "The child is innocent?" Margaret said firmly. "Whatever sins brought him into this world, Eli bears no blame for them." "I know that." The words exploded from him. "God help me, I know that. But Clara, Thomas, they all lied to me. Let me believe. And you—" He turned on her, eyes blazing. "You came here knowing, playing at being the grieving cousin, the noble woman offering help. That's not fair." "Fair?" He laughed bitterly. "Nothing about this is fair. That boy in there thinks his father was a hero who died in a mine. Now I'm supposed to tell him what? That his real father is a monster who preys on servant girls? That his mother abandoned him out of shame? That everything he believes about himself is a lie? Then don't tell him." Margaret stepped closer, her own anger rising. "Not yet. Let him grow up feeling loved and wanted. Isn't that more important than the truth? You sound like Thomas." The accusation hung between them like a blade. Maybe Thomas was right. Maybe love matters more than blood. Silas stared at her, something shifting in his expression. "Is that why you really came? Out of love for Thomas?" The question demanded honesty. "I came because I was a coward 3 years ago. Because I ran when I should have stayed. Because that little boy deserves better than the hand he was dealt. And maybe I do too." They stood facing each other in the dying light, the truth raw between them. Then Silas did something unexpected. He laughed, not the bitter sound from before, but something almost wondering. "We're a fine pair, aren't we? Building a family on other people's secrets. All families have secrets. Silas, the question is what we do with them." He looked back toward the house, where lamplight glowed warm in the windows. "The boy's been happier since you came, less scared. He's been happier since you stopped treating him like glass that might break." The words were gentle but pointed. "I never knew how to— He was so small when he came to us. And then after Thomas died," Silas rubbed his face, "I was afraid I'd fail him like I failed everyone else. You haven't failed anyone." "Haven't I? Thomas is dead. The ranch is barely surviving. And now this—" He gestured with the crumpled letter. Margaret took the letter from his hand, smoothing it carefully. "Thomas made his choices. He chose love over truth, protection over pride." "Can you honestly say you would have done differently?" The fight seemed to drain out of him. No, I'd have done the same." "Then honor his choice. Love that boy the way Thomas intended, not as his brother's son, but as your son. And you," his voice was quiet now, "what's your place in this?" She met his gaze steadily. "I'm here, aren't I? For better or worse. I'm here." They walked back to the house in silence, but it was a different kind of quiet than before, not the absence of words, but the presence of understanding. At the door, Silas caught her arm. "Margaret, I'm sorry for what I said. You're not a coward. It took courage to come here, to face all this. We're all doing our best with the cards we're dealt." Inside, they found Eli had set the table for supper, moving with more confidence than they'd ever seen. He looked up at their entrance, and Margaret saw Thomas's letter had told true. This child deserved love unmarred by the circumstances of his birth. "I made biscuits," Eli announced proudly. "Margaret showed me how yesterday." "They smell wonderful," Silas said, and if his voice was thick with emotion, Eli didn't seem to notice. That night, after the boy had gone to bed, Silas brought out Thomas's photograph, the one Margaret had shown him weeks ago. He set it on the mantel, the first time any image had graced that space. "For Eli," he said simply. "Whatever else, Thomas was the only father he knew for those first months. That counts for something." Margaret nodded, understanding. They were choosing love over truth, just as Thomas had, It might have been wrong by some measures, but in this harsh land where survival itself was a daily battle, perhaps love in any form was its own kind of truth. The letter she tucked away in her trunk, buried beneath linens and memories. Someday, when Eli was older and stronger, when the world had perhaps become a little kinder, they would tell him everything. But for now, they would give him what every child deserved. A home where he was wanted, parents who chose him, and the chance to grow up free from the sins that had marked his beginning. Outside, the winter wind howled its lonely song. But inside, 3 souls were slowly learning how to be a family built not on blood or even truth, but on the daily choice to stay, to care, to love against all odds. The argument started over something small. Eli had forgotten to latch the chicken coop, and a coyote had gotten in during the night. 3 hens dead, feathers scattered like snow across the yard. Silas's response was sharp, sharper than the crime warranted. "How many times have I told you? This is life and death out here, boy." Eli stood frozen, his face crumpling. Margaret stepped between them. "It was an accident. Silas, he's 8 years old. Old enough to know better. Old enough to take responsibility." "Like you're taking responsibility?" The words slipped out before she could stop them. "By yelling at a child for being human?" Silas's face darkened. "Don't tell me how to raise him. He's my—" He stopped abruptly, the unfinished sentence hanging like a noose. "You're what?" Margaret's voice was dangerously quiet. "Go ahead. Finish it." Eli looked between them, confusion and hurt warring in his young face. "I'm sorry about the chickens. I'll be more careful." "Go inside. Eli," Margaret said gently. When he hesitated, she added, "Please, I'll be in shortly." After the door closed, she rounded on Silas. "How dare you?" "I didn't mean—" "Yes, you did. Every time he makes a mistake, every time he reminds you of the truth we're hiding, you pull away. You think he doesn't notice? You don't understand. I understand perfectly." Her voice rose, weeks of frustration boiling over. "You're so afraid of becoming attached that you're breaking his heart bit by bit. He worships you, and you treat him like a burden you're obligated to bear." "That's not true. Isn't it?" "When was the last time you told him you were proud of him? When did you last tuck him in without looking like you were performing a chore?" Silas stood rigid, hands clenched at his sides. "I've fed him, clothed him, kept him safe. That's not enough, and you know it. It's all I have." The words tore from him, raw and desperate. "I don't know how to be what he needs. I look at him and I see all the lies, all the pain. I see Thomas dead in a mine and Clara running scared and some bastard in Denver who—" He broke off, breathing hard. "You see everything but the boy himself." The truth of it hit like a physical blow. Silas staggered, sinking onto the porch steps. Margaret's anger drained away, replaced by something softer. "He heard us." Eli's small voice came from behind the barely opened door. "I heard you talking about my real father." Margaret's heart stopped. She and Silas exchanged stricken looks as the door opened fully, revealing Eli standing there, tears streaming down his face. "My PA. Thomas wasn't my PA. There was no taking it back now." Margaret knelt beside him, gathering his trembling form close. "Oh, sweetheart, don't touch me." Eli wrenched away, backing toward the barn. "You lied. Everyone lied." His voice broke on a sob. "I'm nobody's son. Nobody wanted me." "That's not true," Silas said, rising. "Eli, please." But the boy was already running, disappearing into the growing darkness beyond the barn. Silas moved to follow, but Margaret caught his arm. "Give him a moment. He won't go far." But even as she said it, worry gnawed at her. The temperature was dropping, and snow had been threatening all day. They waited 10 minutes, 20. The sky opened up, releasing thick, heavy flakes that quickly obscured the world beyond the porch. "That's enough." Silas grabbed his coat and a lantern. "He's out there in this—" They searched the barn first, calling Eli's name. The horses stamped nervously, but there was no sign of the boy. Margaret found tracks leading toward the woods, already filling with snow. "He went north," she said. fear making her voice tight. "Toward the ravine." Silas's face went white. The ravine was treacherous in good weather, deadly in a storm. They plunged into the woods, following the rapidly disappearing tracks. The wind howled through the trees, driving snow into their faces. "Eli!" Margaret called until her throat was raw. "Eli, please!" An hour passed. 2. They were both soaked through, stumbling in the deepening snow. Then Silas spotted something. A small form huddled beneath a rock outcropping. "There!" They scrambled down the slope, Silas reaching Eli first. The boy was conscious but shivering violently. His lips blue with cold. "I'm sorry," Eli stammered through chattering teeth. I wanted to disappear like my real ma did." "No." Silas pulled off his coat, wrapping it around the boy. "No more running, no more lies." He lifted Eli into his arms, holding him tight against his chest. "You listen to me, son. I don't care who planted the seed. I don't care about blood or names or any of it. You're mine. You've been mine since the day that preacher put you in my arms. And I'm sorry. God, I'm so sorry I made you doubt that." Eli buried his face in Silas's shoulder, sobbing. Margaret draped her shawl over both of them, and together they fought their way back through the storm. By the time they reached the house, Eli was barely conscious. They worked together in practiced harmony, Margaret heating water and gathering blankets while Silas stripped the boy's wet clothes. They wrapped him in warm layers, Margaret holding him close by the fire while Silas made hot tea with honey. "Tell me," Eli whispered when he could speak again. "Tell me all of it, please." So they did, sitting together by the fire. They told him about Thomas's kindness, about a frightened woman seeking help, about choices made from love rather than obligation. Margaret pulled out Thomas's photograph, showing Eli the face of the man who'd claimed him. "He wasn't my father by blood," she said gently, "but he chose to be your father in every way that mattered, just like Silas chose to raise you after he was gone. And my real mother was very young and very scared. She made sure you'd be safe before she left. That was love too, in its way." Eli was quiet for a long moment, processing. Then he looked at Silas. "You really want me, even knowing?" Silas cupped the boy's face in his weathered hands. "I've made a lot of mistakes, Eli, been too hard, too distant, but never doubt this. You're my son, not Thomas's boy, not anyone else's. Mine, and I'm proud of you every day, even when I'm too fool-stubborn to say it." "What about—" Eli's eyes moved to Margaret. "Are you my mother now?" Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. "If you'll have me." For answer, Eli threw his arms around her neck. Over his head, she met Silas's eyes. Something fundamental had shifted tonight. The careful distances they'd all maintained had collapsed like walls in an earthquake. Later, after Eli had fallen asleep between them on the big bed, neither willing to let him out of sight, Silas spoke into the darkness. "I almost lost him tonight, because of my pride, my fear. But you didn't." Margaret found his hand across the sleeping child. "We didn't. He tested the word, his fingers tightening around hers. "I've been alone so long, I forgot what we felt like. You're not alone anymore. Neither of us is." They lay there in the quiet, hands linked over the child who had brought them together. Outside, the storm began to ease, leaving the world clean and white and new. It felt like a promise, a chance to start over without the weight of secrets. "Margaret?" Silas whispered. "I know we've done this all backwards. Marriage for convenience, building a family on other people's foundations. But somewhere in all this mess, He paused, searching for words that had never come easy. "This feels real to me now. You and Eli, this family we're making." She squeezed his hand, understanding what the admission cost him. "It feels real to me too." Eli stirred between them, mumbling in his sleep. Instinctively, they both moved to soothe him, their hands meeting again over his small form. This time, neither pulled away. The truth was out now, raw and painful, but no longer festering in silence. They would face questions from the town, judgment from those who thought they knew better. But here in this bed, With snow falling soft outside and the warm weight of trust rebuilt between them, they were simply what they'd chosen to be, a family. No more lies, Silas murmured, already drifting towards sleep. No more lies, Margaret agreed. Only love, imperfect and hard-won, but theirs all the same. The house was quiet save for the crackling of the dying fire. Eli had finally fallen into deep sleep in his own bed, exhausted from the emotional turmoil of the day. Margaret sat by the window, brushing out her long hair, while Silas banked the coals for the night. It was a domestic scene, intimate in its ordinariness, yet charged with something new between them. You should rest, Silas said softly. It's been a long day. I'm not tired. She set down the brush, watching him in the reflection of the dark window. I keep thinking about what Eli asked, about being his mother. You answered him true. Did I? She turned to face him. We've been playing at being a family, Silas, going through the motions, but tonight, when we almost lost him, her voice caught. I realized I couldn't bear it. He's become mine in a way I never expected. Silas moved closer, drawn by something in her voice. And that frightens you? Terrifies me. The admission came out barely above a whisper. I came here thinking I was doing my duty to Thomas's memory, but somewhere along the way, it became about Eli himself, and about... She stopped, but her eyes finished the sentence, about you. The air between them seemed to thicken. They'd been careful since the night of the storm, maintaining proper distance despite the growing awareness. But tonight, with truths laid bare and walls torn down, that careful distance felt impossible to sustain. Margaret, her name on his lips was both question and answer. She stood, moving toward him with deliberate steps. We're married in law. We're raising a child together. We've built something here, despite all the reasons we shouldn't have been able to. She stopped just out of reach. Tell me I'm not alone in feeling more. You're not alone. The words seemed pulled from him against his will. God help me. You're not alone in this. She lifted her hand to his face, tracing the lines that hard years had carved there. He caught her wrist, not to stop her but to hold her there, turning his face into her palm. I'm not Thomas, he said roughly. I don't have his easy words or quick laughter. I'm just... You're Silas, she interrupted. The man who took in a child without question, who works himself to exhaustion to keep us fed and safe, who nearly died tonight trying to save that same child. Her other hand came up to frame his face. I didn't come here for Thomas's shadow. I'm here for the man in front of me. The last of his resistance crumbled. He pulled her against him, his mouth finding hers with desperate hunger. She responded with equal fervor, months of careful restraint dissolving in the heat between them. He lifted her easily, carrying her to his room, their room now, no pretense left between them. The door closed softly behind them, shutting out the world beyond. In the darkness, they came together with a tenderness born of shared pain and newfound trust. Hands that had known hard work learned gentleness, exploring with careful reverence. They moved together in the quiet, mindful of the child sleeping down the hall. But the enforced silence only intensified every touch, every breath, every whispered endearment. Margaret had known marriage before this night only in name, but as Silas held her with infinite care, she understood at last what it meant to truly belong to someone. Not possession, but partnership. Not duty, but choice. I love you, she breathed against his shoulder, the words surprising her with their truth. He stilled, then gathered her closer, his voice rough with emotion. And I love you, both of you, my family. They lay entwined afterward, watching snow fall past the window. Margaret traced lazy patterns on his chest, marveling at the solid reality of him. No regrets? He asked quietly. None. You? Only that it took us so long to get here. She smiled in the darkness. Perhaps we needed the journey. All of it, the secrets, the pain, even tonight's near tragedy. It brought us to this wise woman. He pressed a kiss to her hair. How did Eli and I manage before you? You managed, but managing isn't living. No, he agreed. It's not. Morning came soft and bright, the world transformed by fresh snow. Margaret woke to find Silas already up, stoking the fire. He turned at her movement, and the smile that crossed his face was like sunrise itself. "Good morning, Mrs. McBride." The title, spoken with such warmth, made her heart turn over. "Good morning, Mr. McBride." They prepared breakfast together, moving in easy harmony. When Eli appeared, still pale from yesterday's ordeal but clear-eyed, he paused in the doorway. "You look different," he said, studying them with a child's uncanny perception. "Do we?" Margaret asked, fighting a blush. "Happy?" "You both look happy." He climbed into his chair, then added matter-of-factly, "Are you going to have babies now?" Silas choked on his coffee. Margaret bit back a laugh. "Would you like brothers or sisters?" she asked carefully. Eli considered this seriously. "Maybe, if they can't have real parents either, we could take them in. Like you took me." The simple acceptance, the matter-of-fact inclusion of himself in their we, nearly undid them both. Silas reached over to ruffle the boy's hair. "We'll see what the future brings. For now, let's just work on being the best family we can be." "We already are," Eli said with 8-year-old certainty, "even if we're different from other families." After breakfast, they bundled up to check on the animals. The storm damage was minimal, and working together, they soon had everything set to rights. As they headed back to the house, they saw riders approaching. It was Sheriff Watson with 2 deputies. Silas tensed, stepping protectively in front of his family. "Morning, Silas. Mrs. McBride." The sheriff touched his hat. "Hate to trouble you folks, but we've had word from Denver. Man named Judge Blackwood is asking questions about a woman who worked for him years back. Seems she had a child he's claiming rights to." Margaret's blood went cold. Beside her, she felt Silas coil like a spring. "Don't know anything about that," Silas said evenly. "Didn't think you would. Just wanted to give you fair warning. Man like that starts looking for something. He usually finds it, or thinks he does." The sheriff's eyes were knowing. "Course, proving parentage is a tricky thing, especially when there's documentation saying otherwise." "Thomas filed papers," Margaret said suddenly. "Before he died. Legal adoption papers for Eli. I have copies." It was a lie, but the sheriff nodded as if he'd expected nothing less. Good to have paperwork in order. "Judge might have power in Denver, but out here, we take care of our own." He turned his horse. "You folks have a good day now. And Silas, might want to make that marriage of yours official-like. Courthouse is open Mondays and Thursdays." After they left, the 3 of them stood in the snowy yard, processing this new threat. "He's coming for me," Eli said in a small voice. "My real father." "No." Silas knelt in front of him. "That man is nothing to you. Biology doesn't make a father. Love does, and anyone who wants to take you will have to go through me first." "Through us," Margaret corrected. "We're a family now. Official papers or not, but we should get them," Silas said, standing. "The papers. Make everything legal." "Tomorrow's Monday," Margaret noted. "Then tomorrow we go to town. All 3 of us." That night, they sat together planning their next moves. The threat from Denver loomed, but somehow it seemed less frightening faced together. They would need allies, strategies, perhaps even legal help, but they would fight. "I won't run," Margaret said firmly. "Not this time. This is our home." "Our stand," Silas agreed. He looked at Eli, curled between them with his stuffed horse. "Whatever comes, we face it as a family." The fire burned low, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Outside, the vast Wyoming night stretched cold and infinite, but inside their small house, 3 souls had forged something stronger than blood, deeper than law. They'd built love from broken pieces, trust from shared trials, and a fierce determination to protect what they'd made. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Judge Blackwood with his money and influence, the town's reaction to their unconventional family, the struggle to keep the ranch afloat through another hard winter. But tonight, they had each other, and that was enough. More than enough. It was everything. The church was packed despite the bitter January cold. Word had spread through Willow Creek like wildfire. Judge Blackwood from Denver had arrived with 2 lawyers and a court order. He wanted the boy he claimed was his son, and Reverend Porter had called a town meeting to address the matter. Margaret sat between Silas and Eli, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white, across the aisle. Judge Blackwood cut an imposing figure in his expensive suit and gold watch chain. He was perhaps 50, with iron-gray hair and cold eyes that lingered too long on Margaret when he looked their way. "Thank you all for coming," Reverend Porter began. "We're here because one of our families faces a challenge that concerns us all. Judge Blackwood has presented documents claiming parentage of young Eli McBride. His name isn't McBride," the judge interrupted, standing. "The boy is my blood, and I have every right—" "You have no rights here," Silas said, rising as well. "Eli is my son, legal and proper." "Based on what? The word of a dead miner and a woman of questionable virtue." Blackwood's voice dripped contempt. "I have witnesses who'll testify that Clara Morrison was in my employ, that she left suddenly after an incident. The timing of the child's birth speaks for itself." Murmurs rippled through the congregation. Margaret felt Eli trembling beside her and put her arm around him. "What kind of incident?" "Mrs. Henderson called out from the back. "Speak plain. Judge." Blackwood's face darkened. "That's not relevant." "It's entirely relevant," Reverend Porter said firmly. "If you're claiming this child, the circumstances matter." "Clara was troubled," Blackwood said carefully, "given to hysteria and false accusations. When she made certain claims against me, I had no choice but to dismiss her. That she fled here with my child was an act of spite." "Liar." The word came from an unexpected source. Widow Harrison, the town's midwife, standing in her pew. "I tended Clara when she first arrived. That girl wasn't hysterical. She was terrified, had bruises in places that spoke of more than dismissal." The church erupted in shocked whispers. Blackwood's lawyers tried to object, but this wasn't a courtroom, and the townspeople weren't interested in legal niceties. "I have a letter," Margaret announced. Standing, her voice carried clear through the chaos. "Written by Thomas McBride before his death." She pulled out the letter, though her hands shook. Thomas wrote that Clara came to him seeking protection, that she'd been harmed by a man of power who she feared would pursue her. He chose to claim the child to protect both mother and baby. "Hearsay," one of the lawyers protested. "That letter proves nothing." "It proves Thomas McBride was a better man than you'll ever be." Frank Sullivan, the blacksmith, called out. "I worked alongside him. He never lied a day in his life." Fine character witnesses. Blackwood sneered. "But blood is blood. The boy carries my features. Anyone can see it. I'm prepared to take this to federal court if necessary. Then you'll need to go through me first." The voice came from the church doors, where Sheriff Watson stood with several men behind him. But it wasn't the sheriff who'd spoken. It was a woman in traveling clothes, her face wan but determined. "Clara," Margaret breathed. The woman who'd haunted their story like a ghost walked down the aisle, her eyes never leaving Blackwood. The judge's face went white, then red. "You have no standing here," he blustered. "You abandoned the child." "To save his life," Clara said clearly. "And mine." She turned to face the congregation. "Judge Blackwood forced himself on me when I was 17 and in his employ. When I found myself with child, he threatened to have me committed to an asylum if I spoke of it. I ran because I knew he'd either kill me or take the baby to raise as his heir, since his wife couldn't give him children. These are lies. I have proof." Clara pulled out a small journal. "I documented everything. Dates, threats, the names of other girls he'd harmed. I gave copies to a lawyer in San Francisco, with instructions to release them if anything happened to me." The church had gone deadly silent. Blackwood's lawyers were whispering urgently to him, but he shook them off. "Even if your wild tales were true," he said coldly, "I am still the boy's father. I have rights. You have nothing." This time it was Silas who spoke, moving to stand protective in front of Eli. "Thomas McBride claimed this boy as his son. I've raised him as mine. His mother chose to give him to our care. No blood tie gives you claim to a child you've never wanted except as a possession." "Well said." Judge Whitman, the circuit judge, stood from his pew, and, legally sound, Judge Blackwood, "In this territory, abandonment negates any parental claim. The child has been legally adopted by the McBride family. Your petition has no merit. You can't. I can and I will. Moreover, these allegations against you warrant investigation. Sheriff Watson, I suggest you wire the authorities in Denver about looking into Judge Blackwood's household management." Blackwood's face contorted with rage, but his lawyers were already pulling him toward the door. He turned back once, his eyes finding Eli. "This isn't over," he snarled. "Yes, it is." Clara stepped between them. "You come near my son again, and every newspaper from here to Washington will have copies of my journal. Every girl you've hurt will have a voice. Leave now, while you still have a reputation to salvage." After Blackwood and his entourage left, the church exploded in talk. Clara sank into a pew, suddenly looking fragile. Margaret went to her immediately. "You came back." "I've been in California, trying to build a life. But when I heard he was looking for Eli," Clara's eyes found the boy, who was watching her with wide, uncertain eyes. "I couldn't let him take my baby." "He's not a baby anymore," Margaret said gently. "He's a brave, wonderful boy who's been loved every day of his life." Clara's eyes filled with tears. "Thank you for being the mother I couldn't be." The crowd was dispersing, people stopping to pat Silas on the back or squeeze Margaret's shoulder. The town had chosen its side, and it wasn't with the powerful judge from Denver. Finally, only the McBrides and Clara remained. Eli had been silent through everything, but now he stepped forward. "Are you my real ma?" Clara knelt to his level, tears streaming. "I gave birth to you." "Yes, but your real mother is the one who's been here, loving you, teaching you, keeping you safe. I was just the scared girl who made sure you got to the right family." "Why didn't you stay?" The question broke Clara's composure. "Because I was afraid. Afraid he'd find us, hurt you to get to me. I thought you'd be safer if I disappeared." Eli studied her for a long moment, then reached out to touch her wet cheek. "Don't cry. You were brave too. Uncle Silas says sometimes being brave means letting go." Clara caught his hand, pressing a kiss to it. "You're going to be a fine man. Eli McBride, you already are." She stood, addressing Silas and Margaret. "I won't disrupt your lives. I just needed to make sure he was safe, that Blackwood couldn't. I have a teaching position in Sacramento, but perhaps I could write, just to know how he's doing." "Of course," Margaret said immediately. "You're part of his story. Clara, that won't change." They walked out of the church together into the bright winter afternoon. The town square was busy despite the cold, and Margaret noticed people making a point to greet them, to show support. Even Mrs. Pritchard, the worst gossip in town, stopped to say how proud she was of their family. At the edge of town, Clara prepared to board the stage that would take her to the train station. She hugged Eli once, quick and fierce, then turned to Margaret. "Take care of them," she whispered. "All of them." "I will." As the stage pulled away, Eli slipped his hand into Margaret's. "She smelled like lavender, like you." "Did she? I'm glad she came, but I'm glad she's going too. Is that bad?" Silas lifted the boy onto his shoulders. "No, son, that's honest. Sometimes people come into our lives just long enough to set things right, then move on. Doesn't make them less important." They walked home together, Eli chattering about the excitement of the day. The threat that had loomed over them was gone, dissolved by truth and community and one woman's courage. That night, as they tucked Eli in, he looked up at them with serious eyes. "We're a real family now, aren't we? Not because of papers or blood or what anyone says, but because we chose each other. The very best kind of family," Margaret assured him, kissing his forehead. Later, as she and Silas lay together in their bed, she reflected on the day's events. Clara was brave to come back. But you were braver. He pulled her close. "Standing up in that church, fighting for our boy. You've got spine, Mrs. McBride. Our boy," she repeated softly. "I like the sound of that." "So do I." He was quiet for a moment. "Think Blackwood will really stay away?" "I think Clara put the fear of God in him, or at least the fear of public scandal, which for a man like him amounts to the same thing." They lay in comfortable silence, listening to the wind outside. The house that had once echoed with loneliness now felt full to bursting with love and purpose. They'd faced down their demons, claimed their truth, and emerged stronger for it. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. It always did in this unforgiving land. But they would meet them together. This family forged not from perfection, but from the daily choice to love, protect, and belong to each other. 1 year had passed since that day in the church. The small ranch in the red dirt country of New Mexico territory looked different now. The fence stood straight. The barn had a new roof, and green shoots pushed through soil that had been carefully tended. Margaret stood in the doorway of their adobe house, one hand resting on her swollen belly, watching Silas and Eli work together in the vegetable garden. They had left Willow Creek 3 months after the confrontation with Judge Blackwood. Not from fear, but from a desire to start fresh somewhere their story wasn't known by all. The sale of the Wyoming ranch, combined with a small inheritance from one of Margaret's Boston aunts, had given them enough to buy this piece of land where the soil was richer and the winters less brutal. "Ma, the tomatoes are coming in!" Eli ran toward her, taller now at 9, his face alight with joy. "Pa says we'll have enough to sell at market." "Pa." The title had come naturally one day 6 months ago, and Silas had gone very still before pulling the boy into a fierce hug. Now it rolled off Eli's tongue as if it had always been so. "Careful with your mother," Silas called, following at a more measured pace. "She's carrying precious cargo." Eli slowed, placing a gentle hand on Margaret's belly. "When will the baby come?" "Soon," Margaret said, ruffling his dark hair. "Maybe 2 more weeks." "I hope it's a sister," Eli announced. "Pa says I can teach her to ride when she's old enough." "Or him," Silas corrected, joining them on the porch. He wrapped an arm around Margaret, his hand coming to rest over hers on her belly. "Either way, they'll be lucky to have you as a big brother." They stood together, watching the sun paint the desert landscape in shades of gold and crimson. The beauty still took Margaret's breath away. So different from either Boston's crowded streets or Wyoming's harsh plains. "Letter came while you were in the field," she told Silas. "From Clara." Eli perked up. "What does she say?" Margaret fetched the letter from inside. Clara wrote faithfully every month, sharing news of her teaching position and always including a small drawing or pressed flower for Eli. The boy treasured each one, keeping them in a special box by his bed. "She says the school is doing well, and she's been promoted to head teacher. She's also getting married." "Married?" Eli's eyes widened. "To who?" "A merchant named Robert Hartley. She says he's kind and knows about everything. He wants to meet you someday, if we're willing." Eli considered this seriously. "Maybe when I'm older, I could show him my horse." They had given him a pony for his 9th birthday, a gentle mare he'd named Hope. It had been Silas's idea. "Boy needs something that's purely his," he'd said, and Margaret had agreed. After supper, they sat on the porch as was their evening custom. Eli practiced his letters on a slate while Margaret sewed tiny clothes for the baby. Silas whittled a toy horse, his hands sure and steady. The desert evening was peaceful, coyotes calling in the distance, stars beginning to pepper the darkening sky. "Tell me the story," Eli requested, as he did some nights, about how he became a family. Margaret and Silas exchanged smiles. They'd crafted this story together, a version of the truth that honored everyone involved while protecting Eli from the harshest parts until he was older. "Well," Margaret began, "once upon a time, there was a brave man named Thomas who loved a scared young woman and wanted to protect her and her baby." She wove the tale with the gentle honesty of Thomas's kindness, Clara's courage in seeking safety for her child, Silas's steadfast love in raising a boy who wasn't his by blood, and her own journey from duty to devotion. She spoke of how families could be made from choice as much as from birth, how love could grow in the most unexpected places. "And then we all chose each other," Eli finished, the ending he knew by heart. "And we moved here to start our new story." "That's right," Silas said, pulling the boy close. "The best story of all." Later that night, Thomas's letter lay spread on the kitchen table. They'd kept it, along with Clara's journal and the adoption papers they'd finally made official, in a strong box that would someday belong to Eli. But tonight, on the anniversary of the day that had changed everything, they'd pulled it out one last time. "Should we?" Margaret asked. Silas nodded, and together they fed the letter to the fire. They stood watching it burn, the last physical reminder of secrets and shame turning to ash and floating up the chimney. "It's finished now," Silas said quietly. "The past is truly past." Margaret leaned into him, feeling the baby move within her. "And the future?" He placed his hand over their growing child. "The future is whatever we make it, together." 2 weeks later, as a summer storm rolled across the desert, Margaret brought their daughter into the world with Silas holding her hand and the local midwife offering encouragement. When they placed the baby in her arms, Margaret felt her heart expand to make room for this new love. "What should we call her?" Silas asked, his voice thick with emotion. "Faith," Margaret said without hesitation. "Faith McBride, because that's what brought us all together." Eli was allowed in once Margaret was settled. Approaching the bed with careful steps, he stared at his sister with wonder. "She's so small." "You were smaller," Silas told him. "Hard to believe, but you fit in the crook of my arm." "Really?" Eli gently touched the baby's tiny fist. "Hi, Faith. I'm your big brother. I'm going to teach you everything, how to ride and read and catch fireflies. And I'll protect you always, just like Pa protected me." The baby's fingers curled around his, and Eli's face lit with pure joy. That evening, with the storm past and the desert washed clean, they sat together as a family of 4. The journey that had begun with loss and secrets had led them here, to this place of honest love and chosen bonds. Silas pulled out the Bible, finding the passage he wanted. "I've never been much for scripture," he said, "but this seems fitting." He read aloud, "Faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen." "Amen," Margaret whispered, looking at her family, the stoic man who'd learned to speak love aloud, the boy who'd grown secure in their devotion, the baby who would never know anything but belonging. Outside, the desert bloomed after the rain, tough plants that knew how to survive harsh conditions and still produce beauty. Much like their family, Margaret thought. They'd weathered their storms, put down new roots, and now they flourished. Eli had fallen asleep against Silas's shoulder, worn out from the excitement. Faith dozed in Margaret's arms, making tiny sounds of contentment. The oil lamp cast warm light over them all, creating a circle of gold in the vast darkness. "No regrets?" Silas asked softly, echoing his question from another night that now seemed a lifetime ago. "None," Margaret answered, meaning it completely. "This is exactly where we're meant to be." He leaned over to kiss her, careful not to disturb the sleeping children. "Thank you," he whispered, "for coming back, for staying, for all of it." "Thank you," she returned, "for giving me something worth staying for." As if in agreement, baby Faith sighed in her sleep, and Eli stirred just enough to burrow closer to his father. The ranch house that had once sheltered one lonely man now held an entire universe of love, built not on perfection but on the daily choice to face whatever came together. The stars wheeled overhead, constant in their courses, witnessing this small family who had found their way through darkness to create their own light, and in that light, they were home. I raised a boy who wasn't mine by blood, but who became my soul, Silas murmured, looking at his sleeping children. And I found love with a woman who came as duty but stayed as destiny. If that's not evidence of grace, I don't know what is. Margaret smiled, feeling complete in a way she'd never imagined possible when she'd stepped off that train over a year ago. They'd built something beautiful from broken pieces, a family, a future, a love that could weather any storm. And that was the greatest story of all. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the Old West, where love bloomed in the harshest conditions and families were forged by choice rather than chance. If you're listening to this story, I'd love to know where you are in the world. Are you by a cozy fire, on a long drive, or perhaps falling asleep to tales of the frontier? Please subscribe to Wild West Campfire for more stories of courage, redemption, and romance in the American West. And share your thoughts in the comments below. Your stories and connections make our campfire circle complete. Until next time, partners.